And the term we're going to talk about is well-being and happiness. Happiness is a subjective term, so is quality of life, so are a lot of other terms. Like I said, think of one thing that makes you happy. Don't have to say it. One little thing. And do more of it. That's what the research shows. It's pretty good for you. And this isn't this kind of North American high five, good job, let's be happy. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a very European approach to happiness. So, some of the key things about why that's important for us is the outcomes. Abraham Lincoln, people now talk about whether Lincoln was a bipolar depressive, they put lots of labels. People love to put labels on people who are dead because they can't sue them. Yeah? Although having said that, Albert Einstein, Asperger's syndrome, absolutely in a heartbeat. Pavlov, our electrocuting dog fans, Asperger's syndrome, absolutely. People talk about things like Asperger's syndrome, high function autism, like it's a negative. People with Asperger's syndrome have helped us build the atomic bomb, invent really clever gadgets. They might have become head of firms like, I can't say it, because some of the largest computer companies in the world, they're very wealthy people, but we know who they are. Something to do with social media and something to do with the computers we switch on. Those individuals are also thought to be on the spectrum as well, but nobody's brave enough to mention it publicly, because if somebody's worth $80 billion and they get upset with you, you're not going to work again anywhere in the world. So when we talk about happiness, we're not going to talk about just a quick thing about Greek philosophers. They used to talk about hedonism. You'll see the word hedonism. Hedonists are people who just go out and they just don't give a monkey's. Pleasure, 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 pleasure. There's no rules in that. We all met hedonists. But actually, the Greeks also had Epicureans, from the philosopher Epicurus. And Epicureans actually believe in enjoyment as a process, not to go out there and upset others. So actually, in terms of the happiness I'm going to talk about, we're going to talk about it from an Epicurean point of view. Your happiness mustn't impinge on someone else and damage them. You're doing it because it's a journey. So bearing that in mind, and bearing the time, we've had very famous people talk about pleasure and happiness. Sigmund Freud, who got poo-pooed with all these theories, did talk about the pleasure principle. When you're not feeling great, you pleasure yourself in some way. Who has that extra bar of chocolate when you're feeling down? And if it's dark chocolate, it's got anti-carcinogenic properties. 1 cube a day. When it's a bar, it ceases to lose that effect, I understand. Yeah. But within this is an emergence of something in my own profession and in lots of professions here. When we talk about happiness, we're talking about something called positive psychology. The person I recommend you look at on YouTube in this area is Professor Martin Seligman. And Martin Seligman is an incredible man. Has anyone ever heard the term learned helplessness? You get a nice dog, you put it in a cage, you electrocute the floor. It jumps into the safe area. 1976. You get the same dog, you electrocute the floor, but then you electrocute the safe area as well. You'd think those dogs would keep jumping, wouldn't you? Some did. A lot of dogs just gave up. And that's called learned helplessness. That was Martin Seligman's original work, and he's now one of the doyens of happiness and well-being and positive psychology. He's a war criminal, but in a good way. He became chair of the American Psychological Association, and then he finally revealed his true form. He was doing those experiments actually with a serious point about proving that control is important in people's life. When you lose control over what you're doing, it's a recipe for depression and those areas. But he didn't actually like electrocuting the dogs at all. When I first read that study as a student, my first reaction was, even I'm not an animal liberationist, but I want to give this man a serious kicking if I ever met him. He may be coming to the UK next year for a conference, all right? So you can watch this space. Costs a lot of money. But he is one of the people out there who's shown this change process. And he's written lots of really interesting work. The other name, and there's a spot prize, is a Hungarian-born American called Csikszentmihalyi. Why would a man who does something quite profound have a name like that? It's very unhelpful. So one of the first things that people talk about is what's his work. He's one of the psychologists who talks about stress management, and has anyone come across the term flow? Have you come across the term flow? What are they teaching you here these days? Flow psychology is the concept of, you saw it with runners, Csikszentmihalyi saw it with very creative people, where people actually got less stress when they concentrated on their really preferred activity. Sometimes it was a very challenging intellectual activity, climbing or reading books or problem solving or running. You get to a state where your thinking part of your brain starts to just diminish and you're just in the moment. That's called flow. And flow is considered to be very good for your stress management. Most people try to achieve a sense of flow, that's their coping strategy. If you don't have things that achieve a sense of flow, get some. It's very important to people's well-being. I work a lot with people with autism, and you can actually define someone stacking Lego bricks. I used to work with a guy who'd stack all these Lego bricks up. And the staff were nice people, but they were stopping him because they said it was distracting him from the lesson he wanted to learn. But when you watched him stacking his Lego bricks, he stared at it like he was in a trance. It was a flow state. So we had to explain it to them. He's doing that because he's stressed. So if somebody was drowning, would you take their life jacket off them to help them? No, you wouldn't. So let him engage in that. And in fact, before he has to do a difficult task, why don't you encourage him to do it? It worked. It worked really well. Flow task. But I just want to give you a few nuggets here about this area. As I said, there's very few people that I put on a pedestal. Martin Seligman is one of them. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. He's got a really interesting website called AuthenticHappiness.org. It's a really excellent website. Yeah? Contains lots of useful self-help questionnaires. It's free. I've had a go at them. It's always good to have a go and see what it says about you. Are you more of an optimist or a pessimist? Yeah. Is the glass half empty or half full? My family are from Ireland, where there's been an economic meltdown. You listen to the news, the glass isn't half empty, it's gone and it's never coming back. There's been seeds of recovery. It's fragile, it won't happen. There's actually studies that show that people with a pessimistic outcome, a pessimistic view of the world, have poorer health outcomes. And that's even if they live in middle class, well-funded lifestyles. We need to understand that we know an awful lot more, and you guys know an awful lot more about health psychology than you think you do, if you put it together. So, Seligman, to me, all you've got to remember of that is a God. There's some recent reviews, though, of what we call positive psychology studies, 51 recently, most of them showing at least moderate gains. One of my colleagues went, moderate gains? Well, when you look at most of the research in our field, moderate gains is impressive, believe you me. We don't have a lot that's fantastic gains in our field, especially when you're talking about human behaviour, which is really, really complicated. That's the unfortunate thing. What I love about my job is I love the fact that people are complicated. You feel like you're a cracker every day trying to solve problems. And it's not an exact science. Most of the time things go well, I take credit. When they don't go well, blame the staff. Have you heard that before? It's the mantra of lots of useless professionals. Now, Martin talks about a PERMA model. I'm not going to go through that in detail today, but it's a model that says here are the basics that you need in life. You need to experience positive emotion, okay? You need to experience engagement, something you're doing in the day to get out of bed for. You need to have relationships of some kind because they're supportive. They actually, again, are very good for you in terms of illnesses, good relationships. They call that good quality relationships. You need to have meaning in your life and achievement and accomplishments. Now, I'm not going to go through that in detail so much today. What I'm going to focus on, again, is this happiness variable. Happiness is one part of a well-being model. You can have different types of well-being. You can have spiritual well-being. You can have emotional well-being, physical well-being. For the people that you support in your frontline work, you need to be thinking more about physical well-being. The number of people I see who've got gastric problems, who can't communicate that, and then their graph tends to go up after they've eaten their meals, and then they get a behaviour support plan. It's a joke. In 50 years' time, we will look back in this period in history in our field of work and say, this was the support plan age, and actually it was the drugs age. Got a problem? Pump someone full with a psychotropic medication. Do we know what it does to people's biochemistry? Bit. All the major drug companies are getting out and producing drugs for behaviour. And they're saying it's because it's too expensive. But there's another reason why it's expensive. Litigation. Do you remember when the tobacco companies for 70 years said that tobacco doesn't damage your health? And then what happened eventually? There's a precedent in these other fields. We need to be able to say, what does this thing do? Now, that doesn't mean say all drugs are bad, but it does mean we need to think very carefully about how we manage stress by going for the tablets. Yeah? If you run or you exercise, you have more benefits to your stress management in general than anxiolytic medication. But how many people do you support in their support plans are written up for exercise? No, they're written up for Mellarol and chips, so they don't do Mellarol anymore. Oh, why did they ban Mellarol? Oh yes, tyrosine actually was bad for your heart, after years of people saying it was a clean drug. Then there was Prozac. Do I need to carry on? I've even been told a lot of the medical profession, psychiatry is not the area that's growing that people want to get into, as a rule. Bit complicated, people. Our GPs know it. 5 minutes more listening to someone's problems might be more effective than giving them out some anxiolytics. But they're under a lot of pressure. So what do? Give you some drugs. If you want a really interesting fact about our own field, you have the placebo effect. Placebo is not a bad thing. It's in all interventions. Some studies put it as high as 40%. You do something, you'll get a placebo effect, you'll get a gain. But with medication, it's quite important. There are strong placebo effects in a lot of medications. So our population of people with intellectual disabilities never get told about their medication changes. They never get told about the side effects or what they're going to do. So they're going to have a nocebo effect, if that makes sense. It's called a nocebo. So they end up in that situation of no wonder over 60% of the people I support with challenges are on psychotropic medication. But also we found there's an interesting study I saw recently in Germany that showed that even blood pressure medication was slightly less effective with people with severe learning disabilities. Now if you think about the placebo effect, that makes logical sense. You need more of the drug to get the effect because you're not getting the this will do you good. Could you do that with somebody with severe learning disabilities? Yes, you could. You could have a nice smiley face, a nice bar of chocolate, make it a really positive experience, big smiley face, and give the drug, if that's what you wanted to do. But that's for the future. That's for someone to do a PhD in that area. And there's at least 10 PhDs in that area. Here's some research that I really like though. So, you know, many of you have heard of these international studies. The Danes are the happiest race in the world. They have these international league tables. Russians are pretty miserable. Didn't mean that for anyone from Russia. The point about it is that they come from these very simple questions. And this original research by a guy called Fordyce, a lot of psychologists don't like his research because it was simple. Nobody likes simple research, because it can't be right. And what Fordyce did was he asked 2 questions to people. And you can do these yourself now, very quickly. On average, in general, how happy do you feel? From 1 to 10. 0 to 10. 0 being really, really bad, 10 being ecstatically happy. Right now, right this moment, give a number. What's the numbers that come to mind? Come on. Don't think. 7. Any others? 8. 5. God. Have a chat with her after, will you? Any others? 1 before you say it. 7 or 8? Yeah, well, I'm about 8.5, 9 at the moment. Okay. If you ask the second question though, which is more difficult, about over a period of time, on average, what percentage of the time do you feel happy? Not unhappy or neutral. A lot of people, when I do psychology lectures, people say, over what period of time are we talking about? A week, a month, a year? So you have to say a month. So think about the last month, your subjective definition of happiness, what percentage of the time would you say you were happy? That's a harder question to answer, isn't it? You don't have to answer it because I don't want to find out somebody scored 4% because then I'll feel obligated to hang around later and talk to them. And that's not really what I do anymore, you know. The international average answer to question 1 is 6.9, folks. So the Danes on average, the happiest race in the world, I think they on average they scored in the high 7s, but statistically that's a big difference. They're way up there. Yeah. Some races and collective groups scored very low, but the average score for happiness is about 54%. About 50% of the time people report they're happy, which means the other 50% of the time they're not particularly happy, or they don't know. Could you do that exercise for the people with disabilities that you support? You could, and we've done it with some staff teams. You just tell me, Charlotte, I want you to do this for a couple of other staff teams. You know what we're talking about, Charlotte works with me. Just asking that question. Well, what do you mean? Well, how often, what brings a smile to his face? You what? He's not supposed to have a smile on his face. He's got a program to do. Programs aren't meant to be enjoyable. There's even studies now that the same thing applies to education. Educationalists that try and make education enjoyable and creative get better results. When education is just battering facts into people's heads, it doesn't seem to do that well. Or, I'm a governor at a school, if we want to get to North Korean standards, then our kids are going to have to spend 12 hours a day studying. Also, they exercise like crazy and do mindfulness exercises with those children because they want them to drop dead, and they've got a high suicide rate. Or we can accept where we are in the World League tables. Actually, isn't that bad? It's all right. We're kind of not at the top. We're nowhere near the bottom. Why can't this country just accept that? Our education's okay, according to those measures. But if you watched the news recently, you'd have thought our education was the poorest in the world. That's a mindset. That's pessimists, not optimists. That's what I mean about happiness. Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? There's good and bad news. Quite a lot of happiness is genetically determined, but quite a lot isn't. This is an example of optimists and pessimists, folks. An optimist looks at that and says, well, actually, if you think about what you can do by activities and intentional things, you're up to about 50%, and 50% is genetic. So you can either say, oh God, yeah, 50% genetic, can't do anything about that. I can say 50% of my weight problem's genetic. Not much point in me doing anything, is there? We've all heard that story. I actually exercise quite a lot, and it's starting to hurt. And it's good for my well-being. I'd like to lose more weight, but actually I'm doing it for stress management. Because I can't go around the world telling everyone else that exercise is the most powerful stress management tool known to us and just go to the pub every night, which is what happened at a conference quite a few years ago, which I won't put on camera too much. But they know what I'm talking about. Hypocrisy. Doctors who smoke. Another area of hypocrisy. As I said to you, we've particularly been interested in some exercises. This is something you can do yourself tonight. It comes from positive psychology. It's called the 3 good things exercise. All you've got to do at the end of the day, you'll have all these PowerPoints as well, guys, is write down 3 good things that you've done in a day. How do you define good? You define it, not us. Just before you go to sleep at night, 3 good things you did. They don't have to be huge achievements. Write them down. Studies on people's mental health status actually show that if you regularly do the 3 good things exercise, it doesn't cure you, but it actually lifts your mood over time. It's quite interesting when you look at these studies. I used to think they were real, bit too Twilight Zone in nature. In fact, my favourite health psychology study is called the Nun Study. Has anyone heard of the Nun Study? There's a particular group of nuns in the States who lived to their 90s and even their 100s, and a psychologist decided to study them. Don't study what's broken, study what's working really well. What is it about them? Well, their diet is quite healthy, but it doesn't explain enough. Their lifestyle is they were active nuns. They were a religious order that taught, did things. They weren't just sitting in retreat. So what they did, and I think this is really clever, is they took a cohort of nuns' entry applications and they classified them into optimistic or pessimistic. I'm getting in here to get out of the world would be a negative classification. I want to do greater good would be a positive one. And they correlated it with the health outcomes of the nuns. And it correlated very positively. So basically, the people with that kind of mindset seem to live longer. There are now World Health studies looking at perceived control. If you have high perceived control over your life, you'll live longer, is what the odds say. Now, it's good if you're not overweight. It's good if you do all the other factors. But we've needed to explain for years why certain fat people, overweight people, people who smoke, live to a long age. There's a genetic component, but there's still an environmental component. And that's perceived control, not actual control. So people who have high perceived control over their life, you've met them. Oh, I'm not going to do that today. I think I'll do this today. But I will get my job done over there. I'll take my time about things. Yeah? I'll take control of my life and what I'm doing. So that's really quite an interesting factor when you think about health. Add happiness into that, and here are the figures. People who have high indices of happiness recover from illnesses quicker. Very well robust area, we know. Tend to live on average longer, unless you're hit by a car. Can't do a lot about that. But he was happy as the car hit him. Yeah. They tend to have a more positive outlook in life. Quite often there's even one study that implies that people earn more. Now wealth is interesting. What the studies on wealth show is you do need a certain amount of things in your life to also achieve happiness. So you do need some money, but it's not loads. Once you get to your comfort zone, more money doesn't actually bring you any extra well-being or benefits. But people do need that. That's why the fight against poverty is so important in the world. You know, you can't be turning around talking about positive psychology to people who haven't even got any food. And there are some of our cousins in North America who believe they can do that. Don't evangelise to people, get the basics right. So that's why we focus a lot on happiness and well-being with the people we support. I'm going to finish this by saying what you need to do is think about the happiness of the people you support and use the language. Use the language. We even like using the language of stress because it makes people think about things. Language is important. How happy do you think he is? Have the conversations around it, but start with yourself. How happy are you? Again, the studies, to finish you off with a not good time, being ecstatically happy doesn't have the same benefits either. If you're manic, going around laughing and joking all the time, that's only one form of happiness. The other side of happiness is contentment with your life and meaning. So you need both. But I want us, in the next few years, we're writing an article on well-being, happiness and people with autism at the moment, my colleagues and I as well, is to start getting people to start thinking about this language for people. What makes someone happy? I work with a guy that likes to twirl a string and he laughs when he does it. Don't see it as a behaviour that's got to stop. See it as something that's important to his well-being and happiness. To me, it's the next big barrier for the world, stuff we're looking at. Okay? And I'm going to stop there. So